It was the 22nd of December 1944, and a thick gray fog was crawling low across the frozen fields near Hotten, Belgium. Somewhere inside that fog, a column of German Panther tanks was moving forward, confident, almost unhurried, certain that nothing the Americans had could touch them at long range. They were wrong. Hidden on a ridge nearly 3,000 yards away sat a machine most German commanders had never even heard of. It looked weak, thin steel plating, an open top exposed to snow, shrapnel, and the freezing wind. No reputation, no fearsome nickname, nothing that should have frightened anyone. But inside that open turret sat a 90mm gun, the same weapon built to kill the heaviest tanks in Europe at ranges no one thought possible. The crew inside knew something the enemy did not. If they were seen first, they would be dead before they ever got the chance to fire. So they waited, frozen, silent, watching gray shapes drift out of the mist. Then the order came. The trigger fell. What happened in the seconds after would leave German tank crews questioning everything they believed about their own invincibility, and it would happen again and again. Across a stretch of frozen forest the world would come to remember as the Battle of the Bulge. Before we dive in, get comfortable and grab your favorite warm drink. Now, check the time. What does your clock say right now? Leave it in the comments, and let's step back into World War II together. The machine did not look like a killer. Parked in a farmyard outside Hotten, half buried in mud and old snow, the M36 Jackson seemed almost apologetic next to the legends it was about to face. It carried the chassis of the M10, a tank destroyer already considered outdated by late 1944. Its armor was thin enough that a rifle round fired at the right angle could dent the plating, and its turret had no roof at all, only open air above the heads of the men who worked inside it. Snow fell directly onto their shoulders. Shell fragments could rain down from any airburst without warning. It was not a machine built to inspire confidence at first glance. And yet mounted inside that open turret was a 90mm gun, the same weapon fitted to the new Pershing heavy tank, a cannon capable of punching through armor at distances that had shocked American ordnance officers when the first test results came back from the range. The Jackson had entered combat quietly, almost unnoticed, absorbed into the chaos of a front line that had been collapsing and reforming for months. Few war correspondents wrote about it. Fewer German intelligence officers had bothered to catalog it. It was, in every sense, a hidden weapon. The crew inside this particular Jackson belonged to the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, a unit that had landed in France in the summer of 1944 and fought its way from the hedgerows of Normandy to the edge of the Siegfried Line by autumn. Attached to the 3rd Armored Division, the battalion had spent months trading its worn-out M10 tank destroyers for the newer M36, a slow and uneven process that left some companies still fighting with the old, underpowered gun, while others carried the new 90mm cannon into December. The men who crewed these vehicles were not chosen because they were fearless. They were chosen because they were available, trained in a hurry, and sent forward with equipment that was itself still being refined even as it reached the front. Many of them had started the war in other roles entirely, pulled from supply units or reassigned after losses thinned the ranks of infantry divisions further south. They learned the rhythms of their new machine the way soldiers learn everything in wartime, quickly, imperfectly, and under pressure that left no room for a second attempt. A jammed breach in training was an inconvenience. A jammed breach in the Ardennes could mean 4 men dead in the time it took to clear it. The forest around Hotten in late December offered little comfort to men already stretched thin by months of fighting. Pine trees stood black against a gray sky, their branches bowed under wet snow that fell in heavy, silent clumps. The cold worked its way through wool coats and double socks within an hour of standing still, numbing fingers first, then toes, then the mind itself, until simple tasks like loading a shell or reading a map took twice as long as they should have. Frostbite had already claimed more casualties across the Ardennes front than German bullets in some sectors, a quiet, creeping enemy that did not care which side a man fought for. The sergeant commanding this crew was 26 years old, a veteran of the fighting around Aachen who had already buried men he considered friends. He did not talk about it. He rarely talked about anything that was not directly related to keeping his crew alive. Beside him in the cramped fighting compartment sat a gunner barely 22, newly assigned after the battalion's autumn losses, still learning to trust his own instincts under fire. A driver and a loader, both in their early 20s, completed the crew, 4 men packed into a machine that offered them almost no protection beyond the thickness of their own nerve. For months, American tank crews across the European theater had learned to fear the sound of German armor. Since the fighting in Normandy, the Sherman tank, the backbone of the American armored force, had proven dangerously outmatched against the German Panther. A Panther's high-velocity gun could destroy a Sherman from well over 1,000 yards, often before the American crew even realized they were under observation. Tank crews swapped stories in low voices about Shermans brewing up in seconds, about turrets popped clean off their rings, about friends who never had the chance to fire back. Some soldiers passed around a grim nickname for their own tanks, the Ronson, borrowed from a cigarette lighter advertised to light on the first try. Every time, though how widely that particular joke actually traveled through the ranks at the time remains debated among historians today. German tank doctrine by 1944 rested on a simple and, until now, largely accurate assumption. At long range, their armor and their guns were superior to anything the Americans could field in numbers. Panther crews grew confident approaching open ground, trusting that their frontal armor could absorb hits that would kill a Sherman outright, and that their own gun would find its mark first. That confidence had been earned in battle after battle since the summer. The Jackson had been rushed into wider service specifically to break that confidence. Reports from the fighting in the Hurtgen forest and along the German border throughout the autumn had made it painfully clear to American commanders that existing tank destroyers, fast and lightly armed, could not reliably kill the newest German tanks at range. Engineers had taken the proven, mobile chassis of the M10 and married it to the far more powerful 90mm gun in a rushed wartime effort that left little room for refinement. Crews trained on the new vehicle in a matter of weeks, sometimes learning its quirks while already moving toward the front, just as German planners were finalizing the last great offensive in the West. That offensive began on the 16th of December 1944. Along a quiet, lightly defended stretch of the Ardennes forest, German armor surged forward under cover of thick fog and low winter cloud. Weather deliberately chosen because it grounded the Allied aircraft that had punished German columns all autumn. Snow-covered roads filled almost overnight with retreating American units, communication lines collapsed, and rumors spread faster than confirmed reports. Within days, the offensive had torn a deep bulge into the American front, and the name of the operation would later become the name history remembered it by. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 3rd Armored Division, was thrown into the effort to blunt the German advance along its northern shoulder, the sector running through Malempre, Verbomont, and the tangled forest roads leading toward Houghton and the Orth River. Their orders were blunt and left little room for interpretation. Hold the roads. Delay the German advance by whatever means available. Buy time for the rest of the division to organize a coherent defense. The sergeant's crew arrived at their assigned position outside Houghton on the 21st of December, replacing an exhausted infantry outpost that had been holding the line with little more than rifles and a single bazooka. The company commander who briefed them that afternoon was a cautious man, more comfortable with maps than with instinct, and he was skeptical of the sergeant's request to move the Jackson further back onto a wooded rise overlooking the approach road. Standard doctrine placed tank destroyers closer to the expected point of contact, ready to react quickly. The commander saw no reason to deviate from that thinking, not with intelligence reports suggesting the main German thrust was still developing further south. The sergeant argued anyway, He had seen what happened to tank destroyers caught in the open at close range against Panthers, watched crews die trying to outdraw an enemy with a faster, more accurate gun. Distance, he insisted, was the only real advantage his vehicle possessed. If they could see the enemy before the enemy saw them, the 90mm gun could do something no Sherman gun had ever managed reliably. If they could not, the thin armor of the Jackson would offer his men no more protection than the trucks parked beside it. The commander relented only partially, granting the crew permission to select their own firing position within a narrow stretch of high ground, so long as they remained close enough to respond if ordered. That evening, a two-man scouting patrol returned with news that unsettled the whole company. Fresh track marks, wide and deep, cut through a frozen field less than 2 miles from their position, tracks that matched nothing in the American inventory. Broken saplings and crushed hedgerow confirmed what the marks suggested. Heavy German armor, almost certainly Panthers from the 2nd Panzer Division or the 2nd SS Panzer Division, moving through the sector, had already scouted, or perhaps already passed near, the very road the sergeant's crew had been assigned to watch. The company commander, informed of the patrol's findings, said little. There was no time left to relocate the entire company, and no clear order to do so even if there had been. The decision fell, as it so often did in those chaotic days, to the men on the ground. The sergeant moved his crew into the tree line just after dark, using pine branches and frozen brush to break the outline of the vehicle against the snow. They dug a shallow firing position with entrenching tools, hands numb within minutes, breath fogging in the beam of a shielded flashlight. Inside the open turret that night, the crew ate cold rations in silence, watching their breath rise and disappear into a sky without stars. The gunner ran his gloved hand along the breech of the 90mm gun again and again, as though the motion itself might steady his nerves. He thought briefly of the training range back in England, of instructors shouting range estimations over the crack of live fire, of how none of that noise and structure resembled the silence pressing down on the forest now. The loader kept glancing toward the tree line, certain each gust of wind carried the distant grind of engines, then relaxing as the sound faded back into nothing. The driver sat with one hand on the controls even at rest, unwilling to fully surrender the small comfort of readiness. The sergeant used the last hour before midnight to walk the position one final time, checking the depth of the firing pit, the angle of the branches laid across the hull, the sight line down toward the frozen field where the tracks had been found. He thought about the men he had lost outside Aachen, about how quickly confidence could turn into a memorial marker planted in frozen ground. He did not share these thoughts with his crew. There was no value in it, not now, not with the cold already doing enough to wear down their nerve. Instead, he reminded them of the plan, spoken so many times over the past hours that the words had become almost a ritual. Wait for the range, trust the gun, fire once, adjust, fire again. Do not move until it is time to move. None of them slept more than an hour at a time. Somewhere out in the fog and the dark, an enemy who believed himself untouchable at range was moving closer, engines idling low, crews just as cold and just as far from home, though none of them yet understood what waited on the ridge above the road. The 4 men crouched inside a thin-skinned machine, with no name and no reputation understood, without needing to say it aloud, that if they were seen first, none of what came next would matter at all. Dawn on the 22nd of December came slowly, gray light seeping through fog so thick it seemed to swallow sound as well as sight. The sergeant had positioned his crew on a low, wooded rise overlooking the approach road into Houghton, the Jackson's hull tucked behind a screen of frozen brush, its long 90mm barrel angled down toward the valley floor. For nearly 2 hours, nothing moved. The gunner kept his eye pressed to the sight, blinking away the sting of cold air, watching the mist shift and reform without ever quite lifting. Then, just after 8 in the morning, the fog thinned enough to reveal movement. Dark shapes crawled along the frozen road below, engines growling low, exhaust curling upward into the mist like breath from some vast animal. The sergeant raised his binoculars and felt his stomach tighten. Panthers. He counted 4, then a 5th further back, engines idling as the column paused to check the road ahead. Infantry moved alongside the vehicles, rifles slung, breath visible in short bursts as they scanned the tree lines on either side. The range, by the sergeant's estimate, was close to 3,000 yards, a distance that under ordinary circumstances would have made accurate tank fire almost pointless. Standard doctrine and years of accumulated battlefield experience suggested that no vehicle in the American arsenal could reliably hit, let alone penetrate, an enemy tank at such a distance. But the 90mm gun changed the calculation in ways that few German commanders yet understood, and the sergeant intended to prove it. He gave the order quietly, almost conversationally, as though discussing the weather rather than a decision that would determine whether 4 men lived or died in the next several minutes. The gunner adjusted the elevation, accounting for the estimated range, the light crosswind, and the slight downward slope of the ridge. His hands, despite the cold, moved with a steadiness that surprised even him. The loader slid around into the breach and stepped back, bracing himself against the cramped wall of the open turret. The driver kept the engine running low, ready to reposition the moment the first shot revealed their location. The first round left the barrel with a sharp, flat crack, utterly unlike the deeper, rolling boom of German guns, a sound the crew had learned to recognize instinctively after months at the front. For a long moment, nothing seemed to happen. The shell traveled for several seconds, an eternity compressed into heartbeats, before striking the lead Panther high on the turret, just below the mantlet. Smoke curled from the impact point. The tank did not explode, it simply stopped, its turret frozen mid-traverse, as though the machine itself had been startled into stillness. Then flame appeared at the engine deck, small at first, then spreading with a speed that suggested the round had found something vital deep inside the hull. The crew of the stricken Panther began scrambling from hatches, dark figures dropping into the snow and running for the tree line without looking back. Down the column, the second Panther's turret swung wildly, searching for a target that its crew could not locate, confused by muzzle flash that had appeared to come from nowhere in particular, from a ridgeline that offered no obvious silhouette to aim at. For a moment, none of the 4 men inside the Jackson spoke. The silence inside the open turret felt heavier than the noise that had just torn through it, as though the machine itself were holding its breath. The gunner's ears rang from the report of his own gun, a high, thin whine layered over the deeper ringing that had settled into all of their skulls weeks earlier and never fully left. He stared through the sight at the burning shape on the road below, unable, for just a second, to connect the stillness of that distant fire to the motion of his own hands only moments before. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like disbelief, the kind that comes when something rehearsed 100 times in theory finally happens in fact, and the body has not yet caught up with what the eyes have seen. The sergeant's crew did not celebrate. There was no time. The gunner was already adjusting for the second target, working the traverse with quick, economical motions while the loader rammed another round home. The second shot missed cleanly, striking the frozen ground short of its target and throwing up a spray of dirt and snow that briefly obscured the road. The third round, fired only seconds later, struck the second Panther's hull just forward of the turret ring. It did not penetrate, the angle too shallow, the range too extreme even for the 90mm gun's considerable power, but the impact was enough to halt the vehicle and force its commander into a hurried, disorganized retreat back the way it had come. Along the column, confusion spread faster than any single shell could travel. Reports from German units engaged that week describe an unseen weapon striking from ranges no one had planned for, an unnerving experience that stripped away the confidence Panther crews had carried since the summer's fighting. Some believed the fire came from a heavier tank hidden somewhere in the trees. Others suspected a battery of dug-in anti-tank guns, positioned with unusual skill. Very few correctly guessed that the fire came from a single thin-skinned tank destroyer with an open turret, manned by 4 exhausted Americans who had not slept more than a few hours combined over the past 2 days. The remaining Panthers withdrew from the exposed stretch of road, seeking cover in a stand of trees roughly a mile distant. For the sergeant's crew, this was not a moment of triumph so much as a fragile reprieve. They knew the German column would regroup, would send infantry forward to search the ridge line on foot, would eventually locate the position that had cost them a tank and the illusion of invulnerability that had carried them this far into the offensive. The sergeant ordered his crew to withdraw immediately, backing the Jackson carefully down a logging trail that had been scouted the previous evening precisely for this purpose. Fire and move. Never stay to admire the result. Word of the engagement spread quickly through the battalion over the following hours, carried by field telephone and by the nervous, excited chatter of runners moving between command posts. The company commander who had questioned the sergeant's request to reposition the night before said nothing when the report reached him, though something in his expression shifted, a flicker of reassessment that would shape how he deployed his remaining crews in the days ahead. Other sergeants began asking questions about firing positions, about range estimation, about the specific mixture of patience and nerve that had allowed a single shot to reach across nearly 3,000 yards of frozen Belgian countryside and end a war for 5 German tank crewmen in the span of a few seconds. By the following day, the 23rd of December, the battalion had shifted several of its M36 crews further south and west toward the town of Marche-en-Famenne, where intelligence suggested German armor was probing for a weak point in the American line. The sergeant's crew moved with them, exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline, the earlier engagement already feeling distant beneath the weight of new orders and new terrain to learn. Marche presented different challenges. The countryside opened into wider, rolling fields, offering longer sight lines but also less natural cover for a vehicle that depended entirely on concealment for survival. The crew spent the better part of an afternoon selecting and preparing a new position on a low hill overlooking 2 intersecting roads, using canvas, branches, and packed snow to break up the Jackson's silhouette against the white landscape. They worked in near silence, each man conserving energy against the deepening cold, aware that the coming days would likely demand more of them than the one that had just passed. The sergeant used the quiet hours of the journey to Marche to think, for the first time in days, about the strange history of the weapon his crew now depended on. The 90mm gun had begun life as an anti-aircraft weapon, designed to reach high into the sky and bring down bombers, not to duel with armored vehicles at ground level. Only the pressure of battlefield necessity, the repeated failure of smaller American guns to stop the newest German tanks, had pushed ordnance engineers toward a hurried, unglamorous solution, bolting a proven anti-aircraft cannon onto a tank destroyer chassis that had never been designed to carry it. There had been no time for elegant engineering, no opportunity to build a vehicle from the ground up around the weapon's considerable weight and recoil. The result was exactly what the sergeant commanded now, a machine that felt improvised because it was, held together by wartime urgency rather than careful design, yet capable of reaching further and hitting harder than anything else wearing an American star. He thought, too, about the ordnance officers back in England who had first tested the combination, about the almost disbelieving tone of the early reports describing penetration figures that exceeded anything achieved by existing American tank guns. Nobody in those testing grounds could have predicted that the numbers on a firing range chart would translate, only months later, into a column of burning Panthers on a frozen road outside Ardennes. War had a way of turning abstract statistics into very concrete, very personal outcomes, and the sergeant understood now, more clearly than any report could have explained, exactly what those numbers meant when the range closed to less than a mile and the enemy still believed himself safe. It was during this period that the battalion's supply situation began to weigh heavily on every decision the crew made. Armor-piercing ammunition, particularly the newer high-velocity rounds capable of defeating the thickest German armor at extended range, remained scarce across the front, rationed carefully, and distributed only where commanders judged the need greatest. The sergeant's crew carried barely a handful of these specialized rounds, a fraction of what they might have wanted given how effective the ammunition had proven against Panther armor at range. Standard rounds remained plentiful, reliable against lighter vehicles and softer targets, but the crew understood that if a Panther appeared at extreme range again, they would likely have only one or two chances to make the scarce ammunition count. This scarcity forced a kind of discipline onto the crew that went beyond simple marksmanship. The sergeant began instructing his gunner to hold fire even when tempting targets appeared, waiting instead for the vehicle most likely to anchor a column, the lead tank, the command vehicle, the target whose destruction would do the most to slow or confuse the German advance. It was a gamble each time, a bet that patience would be rewarded rather than punished by a target moving out of range or behind cover before the decisive shot could be taken. On the night of the 24th of December, word reached the battalion that German armor, elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, had broken through American positions near the town of Mannheim, a critical crossroads that anchored the flank of the entire northern shoulder of the offensive. The breakthrough threatened to unravel days of careful, costly defensive work, opening a path that German commanders hoped would finally reach the Meuse River and the open country beyond it. Orders arrived for available tank destroyer crews to reposition immediately, moving through darkness and confusion toward the collapsing line. The sergeant's crew moved out just before midnight, the Jackson grinding along icy roads clogged with retreating vehicles, refugees, and confused infantry searching for their units in the dark. Artillery fire flashed intermittently against the low clouds to the east, followed seconds later by the distant, rolling thunder of impact. The crew rode in tense silence, each man privately calculating the odds of reaching Mannheim before the German advance swallowed the crossroads entirely. The cold that night had a different quality than the cold of the days before, sharper somehow, carrying the metallic smell of spent artillery mixed with the sweetness of pine sap from shattered trees along the roadside. Every few minutes, the sky to the east flickered orange, followed by a distant crump that the men had learned to gauge for distance and direction without conscious thought, an instinct built from months of survival rather than any training manual. The loaders stared out at the passing wreckage along the roadside, an overturned supply truck, a burned-out half-track, a soldier's helmet abandoned in a ditch, and said nothing, his jaw tight, his good hand gripping the edge of the turret hard enough to whiten his knuckles beneath his gloves. They arrived to find chaos. American infantry, some wounded, others simply exhausted past the point of coherent thought, streamed back along the road the Jackson was trying to move up. A young officer, his voice hoarse from shouting, redirected the sergeant toward a position on a low embankment overlooking the southern approach to the crossroads, the last defensible ground before the road opened into the town itself. There was no time to properly prepare the position, no time to break up the vehicle's silhouette with branches or snow. The crew simply nosed the Jackson into the tree line, engine running, gun already trained down the approach road, and waited. German artillery found the general area within the hour, shells falling in irregular, unpredictable patterns that offered no warning beyond the whistle of incoming rounds. One shell landed close enough to shower the open turret with dirt, ice, and jagged metal fragments. The loader cried out, a fragment tearing through his upper arm just above the elbow, blood dark against the snow that dusted the turret floor. He did not let go of the shell he was carrying. He simply pressed his good hand against the wound, gritted his teeth, and continued his work, loading the round with movements that had become mechanical through repetition, through sheer necessity. The sergeant checked the wound quickly, wrapped it with a field dressing pulled from his own kit, and made the decision that would define the rest of that terrible night. They would not withdraw, not yet, not while German armor was still visible moving toward the crossroads less than 2 miles distant. Every minute they held this position was a minute the infantry behind them could use to organize a defense. to dig in, to bring up whatever reinforcements remained available in a sector already stretched to its breaking point. Through the smoke and falling snow, the gunner spotted movement, a column of vehicles advancing along the road with the confident, unhurried pace of a force that believed the way ahead was clear. Panthers again, at least 3 visible, moving in close formation with infantry riding on the rear decks, rifles ready, faces hidden beneath helmets and scarves against the bitter cold. The range was extreme, perhaps 2,700 yards by the sergeant's rough estimate, calculated as much by instinct as by the careful measurements the crew had practiced in calmer moments. The gunner hesitated for only a heartbeat before the sergeant's voice, low and steady despite everything, cut through the tension. "Fire when ready." The first round struck the lead Panther below the turret ring, jamming the traverse mechanism and wounding the gunner inside, though the vehicle did not immediately halt. The second round, fired within seconds using one of the precious high-velocity rounds the crew had been hoarding for exactly this moment, punched through the Panther's side armor as the tank attempted an awkward, panicked turn. Flame erupted almost instantly, spreading from the engine compartment through the fighting compartment with a speed that left little doubt about the fate of the crew inside. Infantry riding the remaining tanks leapt for cover, scattering into ditches and behind whatever frozen terrain offered concealment. Machine gun fire from a nearby American position stitching lines across the snow around them. The second Panther attempted to reverse away from the ambush, engine roaring in protest against the icy road surface, but a third round from the Jackson caught it squarely in the rear deck, where armor had always been thinnest, where designers had gambled that no enemy would ever get behind a Panther in open battle. The gamble failed that night. The tank shuddered to a halt, smoke thickening into flame within moments. The third Panther, along with the surviving infantry, broke off the advance entirely, retreating back along the road under a hail of machine gun fire that followed them until they disappeared into the darkness and falling snow. The immediate threat to the crossroads had been blunted, though not eliminated, and the sergeant knew with grim certainty that more German armor remained somewhere beyond the tree line, regrouping, reassessing, preparing for another attempt once daylight returned. The crew held their position through the remainder of that brutal night, the loader's wound bandaged, as well as circumstances allowed, his face pale, but his hands still steady enough to load each round the gunner called for. They ate nothing. They spoke only when necessary, conserving words the way they conserved ammunition, aware that every resource, physical and otherwise, had grown precious in ways none of them had anticipated when they first climbed into this thin-skinned, unglamorous machine months earlier. Somewhere in the long, freezing hours between the second engagement and dawn, the sergeant found himself thinking about the choice he had made when the loader was hit. The decision to stay rather than withdraw to safety with a wounded man aboard. It was not a decision covered by any manual, not something an officer could have ordered him to do or not do. It had simply presented itself in the space of a few seconds, and he had chosen, the way men in that war so often chose, based on what felt unbearable to live with afterward, rather than what felt safest in the moment. He did not know, sitting there in the dark with frost forming on his eyebrows, whether it had been the right choice. He only knew that the crossroads had held, and that mattered more, in that moment, than any question of what might have happened otherwise. The loader, for his part, never mentioned wanting to be evacuated, not once through the entire ordeal. When the sergeant asked him afterward why he had not said something, had not asked to be taken back to an aid station the moment the wound was dressed, the younger man simply shrugged, wincing at the movement, and said that leaving would have meant one less pair of hands on the gun, and one less pair of hands felt, at that particular crossroads, on that particular night, like something the line could not afford to lose. It was not the kind of statement anyone would carve onto a monument. It was simply true, spoken plainly by an exhausted young man who had not expected to be tested in quite this way when he first volunteered for tank destroyer duty back in the spring. By the gray light of dawn on the 25th of December, Christmas morning, The immediate crisis at Manhay had stabilized, though the town itself would not be fully recaptured for several more days. Reinforcements finally reached the crossroads, fresh infantry and additional armor arriving to relieve crews who had held the line through a night few of them expected to survive. The sergeant's crew was pulled back at last, the Jackson's fuel tank nearly empty, its ammunition reduced to a handful of standard rounds, and no high-velocity ammunition remaining at all. The cost of those hours had been steep, measured not only in the loader's wound but in the accumulated exhaustion that had begun to blur the edges of every decision, every calculation, every shot fired across distances that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. Yet the results spoke plainly enough to anyone reviewing the battalion's after-action reports. German armor that had advanced with such confidence toward the Meuse River now moved more cautiously, sending infantry ahead to screen exposed approaches, halting at tree lines to scan ridges that might conceal another unseen gun. The psychological toll of those long-range engagements had begun to outweigh even the material losses, and in an offensive that depended entirely on speed and momentum to succeed, hesitation of any kind had become a kind of slow, creeping defeat. By the 26th of December, the offensive that had once threatened to reach the Meuse River was beginning, slowly and unevenly, to lose its momentum. Fuel that German planners had counted on capturing from American depots never materialized in the quantities the offensive required, and columns of tanks that had rolled forward with such confidence 10 days earlier now sat idle along roadsides, engines silent, crews waiting for fuel trucks that could not fight their way through clogged, cratered roads. Overhead, the weather that had grounded Allied aircraft since the offensive began finally broke, revealing clear winter skies that fighter bombers used to devastating effect against exposed German columns. Around Manhay, American forces organized a deliberate counterattack, infantry and armor moving forward together to reclaim the crossroads that had been so bitterly contested over the previous 2 days. The sergeant's crew, their Jackson refueled and rearmed as well as the strained supply lines allowed, took part in the advance, though by this point the engagement felt different from the desperate, isolated stands of the days before. This was organized, supported, deliberate, a coordinated push rather than a lone vehicle holding a line alone in the dark. The town was retaken on the 27th of December, the German units that had punched through days earlier now falling back in a retreat that would only accelerate over the following weeks. The company commander who had questioned the sergeant's judgment on that first night outside Houghton found him during a brief lull in the fighting as the crew refueled and performed what maintenance they could manage on equipment that had been pushed far beyond its intended limits. He did not offer an elaborate apology, was not the kind of man inclined toward such gestures, but he acknowledged plainly that the sergeant's instincts about positioning, about distance, about the value of patience over aggression had proven sound in ways the standard doctrine had not anticipated. He informed the sergeant that similar firing positions, chosen for long sight lines and careful concealment rather than proximity to expected contact, were being adopted more widely across the battalion's remaining companies. What had begun as one crew's stubborn insistence on doing things differently was becoming something closer to accepted practice. The sergeant received this acknowledgement without much visible reaction. There was little room left in him, after 5 days of near constant tension, for pride or vindication. He thought instead of the men who had not survived the fighting around Manhay, infantry he had watched retreat past his position in the dark, some of them wounded, some of them simply gone by morning. He thought of the loader, still nursing his bandaged arm, who had refused evacuation not out of bravado, but out of a plain, unglamorous sense of duty to the 3 other men who depended on him. Whatever satisfaction existed in having helped blunt a German division's advance felt small and quiet next to the weight of everything the past week had cost. He allowed himself, in the relative calm of that refueling stop, a single quiet moment to look back at the Jackson itself, streaked with soot and frozen mud, One track guard bent from a near miss outside Marche, the canvas cover over the open turret torn in two places by shrapnel that had missed the crew by inches rather than feet. It did not look like a weapon that had helped stop a division. It looked like what it was, an improvised machine held together by cold hands and constant effort, asked to do far more than its designers had ever intended when they bolted an anti-aircraft gun onto a chassis built for something else entirely. And yet it had held. Every time it had mattered, it had held. The driver, quiet through most of the campaign, spoke up during that same pause, asking the sergeant in a low voice whether he thought people back home would ever understand what a week like this one had actually involved. The sergeant considered the question longer than the driver expected, watching steam rise from a canteen of coffee passed between the crew. He said he did not think so. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. Newspapers would write about the infantry at Bastogne, about tanks and generals and the shape of the Bulge on a map. Nobody would write much about four men in an open turret, freezing, waiting, trusting a gun that had never been meant for this kind of work. He did not say this bitterly. It was simply, in his estimation, the nature of the war they were fighting, and there was no use resenting it. Across the wider battlefield, reports continued to filter back through German command channels describing an American weapon capable of striking from ranges no doctrine had prepared their crews to expect. Interrogations of captured soldiers and officers in the days that followed revealed a persistent confusion about the source of these long-range engagements. Some prisoners insisted they had faced a new, heavier tank kept secret from Allied propaganda. Others described what they believed were fixed anti-tank positions of unusual caliber, dug in and camouflaged with a skill that suggested specialized training. The truth, communicated slowly and unevenly through after-action reports and battalion histories compiled long after the guns fell silent, was both simpler and more remarkable than either theory. A handful of thinly armored, hastily improvised tank destroyers, manned by exhausted crews with only weeks of experience on their new equipment, had inflicted losses on Germany's most feared armored formations without ever allowing the enemy to close to a range where his own advantages could be brought to bear. The psychological cost to German tank crews proved, in the assessment of officers on both sides who later studied the campaign, nearly as significant as the material losses themselves. Panther crews who had advanced through the autumn with practiced confidence, trusting their armor and their gun to win any exchange at range, now approached open ground with a hesitation that had not existed 2 weeks earlier. Commanders requested additional infantry screens to scout ahead of armor before committing to open terrain. Advances that might once have moved with speed and aggression now proceeded cautiously, probing forward in short bounds, watching ridge lines and tree lines for muzzle flashes that might never come, but that crews had learned, through hard and bloody experience, could appear from almost anywhere. For an offensive that depended entirely on speed, on reaching the Meuse River and beyond before Allied reserves could organize an effective response, this creeping hesitation proved corrosive in ways no single engagement could fully capture. Hours lost to caution accumulated into days. Days lost accumulated into a stalled offensive, then a retreat. Then, by the final weeks of January 1945, a slow collapse back toward the German border, along roads littered with abandoned vehicles, many of them destroyed not in dramatic close-range duels, but by guns that had struck from distances their crews had never thought to fear. The sergeant's crew continued to serve through the remaining weeks of the campaign, their Jackson patched and repaired as best the battalion's limited maintenance resources allowed. Its crew never fully rested, never fully warm, but alive in a war that had claimed so many others around them. They fought in smaller engagements through January, supporting the slow, grinding pushback toward the positions German forces had held before the offensive began, though none of the later fighting matched the desperate intensity of those first days around Hotten and Manhay. The loader's wound healed enough, after several weeks, for him to return to something close to full duty, though the arm never regained quite the same strength it had carried before a fragment of German steel tore through it on a snow-covered embankment outside Mannheim. He rarely spoke of that night to anyone outside his own crew, and even then, only in brief, understated terms that gave little indication of what the hours had actually demanded of him. The gunner carried forward a steadiness under fire that had not existed in him when the campaign began, forged in those first terrifying seconds outside Houghton when theory had become fact and a distant shape on a frozen road had turned, in an instant, into a column of smoke and flame. History would not remember the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion with the same prominence given to the infantry divisions that held Bastogne, or the armored spearheads that eventually pushed the German offensive back across its starting line. Tank destroyer crews rarely received the public recognition afforded to more visible units, their work conducted quietly, often from concealed positions miles from the nearest journalist or photographer, their contributions measured in burned-out enemy vehicles rather than dramatic headlines. Yet the record left behind in unit histories and after-action reports tells a clear and consistent story. In sector after sector, along the northern shoulder of the German offensive, it was often these thinly armored, unglamorous machines, armed with a gun originally designed to shoot down aircraft, that broke the momentum German commanders needed most and could least afford to lose. The Battle of the Bulge would end, in the final analysis compiled by historians in the years that followed, not with a single dramatic turning point, but with an accumulation of small, costly delays, each one bought by soldiers and machines that rarely received individual credit for the outcome they helped secure. Among those delays, scattered across the frozen roads between Houghton, Marche, and Mannheim, were the handful of seconds it took a 90mm shell to cross nearly 3,000 yards of freezing Belgian air and strike an enemy who had believed, with total and unshaken confidence, that distance itself was a kind of safety. The Germans had prepared for tanks. They had prepared for artillery. They had studied Allied air power, Allied fuel reserves, Allied reinforcement schedules, every visible factor that might decide the outcome of their last great gamble in the West. What they had not prepared for was a hidden gun, mounted on a machine most of them had never heard of, crewed by men whose names would never appear in any German intelligence file, waiting patiently on a ridgeline for the fog to lift just enough to take aim.